Yeah. We the people are in the beginning, above the noise, and present at the moment. My friends, I want to ask a simple question. What are you? Not what do you do, not where are you from, not what do you believe, not what political party you belong to, not what church you attend, not what profession pays your bills, not what title hangs on your office door, but what you are. And before you answer, I want you to consider something. How many times in your life have you been given a name, a label, a category, a role, and then been told that it was your identity? How many times? Were you born with those labels, or were they handed to you? Were they discovered, or were they assigned? And if they were assigned, what happens when they are taken away? If a soldier leaves the battlefield, is he no longer himself? If a teacher retires, does she cease to exist? If a parent loses a child, has that parent's identity disappeared? If a fisherman stops fishing, what exactly was lost? If a teacher is a teacher, is she automatically a female? The activity or the being? And if the being remains, then what was the identity in the first place? These are not easy questions, but perhaps they are important questions, because many of the struggles of human life seem to revolve around one thing: the confusion between what we do and what we are, the confusion between our roles and our identity, the confusion between the temporary and the permanent. And so I ask another question. What if much of human conflict begins when we mistake a role for an identity? What if we build our entire lives upon things that can be taken away? What happens when the job disappears? What happens when the relationship ends? What happens when the status vanishes? What happens when the crowd turns against us? What happens when age catches up with the body? What happens when circumstances change? What remains? What survives? And perhaps the most important question, what was actually you in the first place? We live in a world that constantly offers identities: consumer, citizen, believer, skeptic, worker, leader, victim, winner, loser, expert, beginner. And every day we are encouraged to wrap ourselves in these descriptions until we can no longer distinguish between the garment and the person wearing it. But are these identities, or are they merely descriptions? When a man fishes, must he become a fisherman? When a woman teaches, must she become a teacher? When someone lives in a place, must they become that place? Or have we simply become accustomed to turning actions into identities? And what is the cost of doing so? Because every identity we attach to ourselves creates a possibility: the possibility of conflict, the possibility of loss, the possibility that someone can change what we think we are. And if our security depends on those identities, what happens when they are questioned? Why does criticism hurt so much? Why do insults cut so deeply? Why do people become defensive? Why do nations divide? Why do families fracture? Why do communities splinter? Could it be because we are defending identities that were never stable to begin with? Now consider another possibility. What if beneath every role, every title, every category, there is something simpler? What if there is something that exists before every description? What if there is something that remains after every description is removed? What if there is something that does not depend upon agreement, something that does not depend on recognition, something that does not depend on approval? What if there is simply people? People before politics, people before ideology, people before institutions, people before labels, people before categories, people before arguments, people before explanations, people before definitions. And if that were true, what would change? Would fear lose some of its power? Would manipulation become more difficult? Would division become harder to sustain? Would it become more difficult for someone to convince you that you must hate another person because of a label? Would it become more difficult to convince you that your value depends on a role? Would it become more difficult to convince you that you are incomplete without external validation? And if so, why? Why would a stable identity create stability? Why would security create security? Why would certainty reduce confusion? These are questions worth asking because history is filled with examples of people attaching themselves to temporary things, temporary movements, temporary trends, temporary authorities, temporary explanations, temporary systems. And many of those systems seemed like good ideas at the time, didn't they? How many things have human beings done because they sounded like good ideas at the time? How many decisions have been justified in the moment only to be regretted later? How many times has humanity traded what was enduring for what was convenient? How many times have we accepted a label without asking where it came from? How many times have we accepted a description without asking whether it actually described us? And if we do not ask those questions, who benefits? Who benefits when people do not examine identity? Who benefits when people define themselves entirely through categories? Who benefits when people become dependent upon external approval? Who benefits when people are afraid of losing labels? Perhaps another question is necessary. What is freedom? Is freedom merely the ability to choose between options, or is freedom the ability to remain yourself regardless of which option is chosen? Can someone be free if their identity depends entirely upon circumstances? Can someone be free if they must constantly seek validation? Can someone be free if they are terrified of losing a role? Can someone be free if they do not know what they are apart from their descriptions? These questions matter because freedom without identity becomes drift, and identity without examination becomes dogma. Both are dangerous. So, where do we begin? Perhaps we begin where all meaningful inquiry begins, with honesty, with the willingness to ask difficult questions, with the willingness to look directly at ourselves, not to confirm what we already believe, not to defend what is comfortable, but to investigate, to examine, to wonder, to ask. What remains if everything else is stripped away? What remains if every title disappears? What remains if every role changes? What remains if every external validation is withdrawn? What remains if no one applauds? What remains if no one agrees? What remains if no one understands? Would there still be something there? And if there would be, shouldn't we know what it is? Shouldn't that be one of the most important investigations of a human life? Not merely what we do, not merely what we possess, not merely what we believe, but what we are. Because perhaps security does not come from accumulating more identities. Perhaps security comes from understanding which things are identities and which things are merely descriptions. Perhaps wisdom begins when we stop confusing the two. Perhaps strength begins when we recognize the difference. Perhaps freedom begins when we stop allowing every passing circumstance to redefine us. And perhaps the most profound question of all is this: if there is something fundamental beneath every role, every label, every category, every opinion, every conflict, every institution, every description, what is it? And are we courageous enough to find out? Thank you.